Welcome to the Christian Men at Work podcast, where I interview men from all walks of life with varying job titles who have one thing in common. They are all choosing daily to live out their Christian faith through their work, and because of that, they are leading, prospering, glorifying God, and experiencing joy and purpose in their work. And you can too. Men at Work, welcome to episode 45. We'll start with a quick walking tip. We're often good at thanking God for our food, but do we thank Him for when we get our paycheck? God doesn't just give us the stuff that we have in life, but He also gives us the means and the ability to get the stuff. So think about what you may be taking credit for, particularly relating to your work and your finances, and remember that you could do anything without God, and that God is the owner of everything in your life, and that you're, as well as your work, and that you are a manager of what you have. And this tip was based on a sermon from our pastor, Pastor Adam at Union Church here in North Carolina. Today I'm going to be interviewing Raleigh Sadler. Since 2001, Raleigh has served in Christian ministry. Currently, he's the founder and executive director of Let My People Go, which is headquartered in New York City. His passion is to see the local church fight global injustices like human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable. He believes that the church should be leading the way in the fight against human trafficking because the gospel frees us to pursue justice and mercy in our communities. With this message, he's worked with churches, universities, and other collaborative organizations around the country. He believes it's the responsibility of the church to love those who are at risk of exploitation. His book, Vulnerable: Rethinking Human Trafficking, was released in February of this year. And as you'll see in the interview, I really focused this issue of vulnerability on the walk that we as men have. We do certainly talk about human trafficking, but I just want you to know up front that we talk a lot about this whole issue of vulnerability and what it means to us as Christian men in our walk with God and with others in our life. So let's get right to our interview. Raleigh, thanks a lot for joining the conversation today. How are you?
I'm doing well, Dave. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, I'm going to ask you my first question, which is, how did you become a Christian?
So it's interesting. I grew up in a family where my mother had been baptized at an early age, and my father had actually not come to Christ. So it was not necessarily a Christian household. My mom wasn't necessarily walking with Christ during that season. And I was a child who our neighbors took me to this vacation Bible school, of all things, at a small Presbyterian USA church in my hometown. And I remember them having cookies and milk, and it was delicious. And I just remember thinking that must have been the Baptist church. So I kept telling my parents, I want to go to the Baptist church. I want to go to the Baptist church. So when a church came to the front door and said, "Hey, you guys should come to church," I was like, yes, and my parents went, and come to find out there were no cookies, but, I would later pray to receive Christ. And so at 8 years old, and though I doubted that decision for years, I do believe that it was with the faith of a child that I received Christ. And so.
Well, I've heard that question answered related to food often. There's been a couple times where pizza parties were what got people in, and I know at our church they have some delicious cookies every week, so it doesn't hurt, I guess.
No. It never hurts to have cookies. I think cookies are delicious.
All right. Well, tell us what you do for a living, and then maybe give us a quick overview as to how you got just kind of a walkthrough as to, from a career standpoint, how did you get to do what you're doing today?
Yeah, so I run a nonprofit called Let My People Go. I'm the executive director and founder of it. And it really exists to empower the local church to fight human trafficking by loving those most vulnerable, really to care for the very people that traffickers target, because human trafficking is ultimately the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain. So all that said, I thought I was just going to spend my life being a pastor, and I wanted to be a pastor. That was the end game for me. And that's one of the reasons I'm excited to still work with pastors. But yeah, it was funny. I never thought I would end up doing anything else. And then I remember being at a conference and learning about human trafficking, and I started sensing that God was leading me into this, and I went kicking and screaming. And I finally came to a point where I was like, okay, God, I'm going to do whatever you're calling me to do, even if it scares me, even if it's uncomfortable, even if I don't even know what that means right now. Because at the time, I didn't even know what it meant to fight human trafficking as a Christian. But I would later, sell everything I owned and move to New York to figure it out.
And if I read this right, you actually lost what you considered your dream job prior to this. Is that right?
Yeah. I was a college pastor in West Virginia, and that's all I ever wanted to be. I was a campus minister, so to speak. And then I found out that they were phasing out the job because of budget constraints. And it was kind of like, we love you, but we've got no place for you. And there was really no other option. I was calling, I was checking places out. And it was as if like God was calling me to this thing and then graciously hedging me in and showing me that, wow, I have to trust that he knows what's best. And what's funny is once I started doing this work, I realized, man, I loved college ministry, but I really love what I do now. Like it's at a different level.
Right. Well, if I could park there just for a minute about this whole issue of job change as well as other big changes in life and kind of seeking God's will, because that's a topic that comes up from time to time on this podcast. You made a comment in the book that I think you quoted Henry Blackaby, and he said that the key to discovering the will for your life is to find where God is at work and to join him there. Is that a guiding principle that you think all of us can use for like big decisions like this?
It's funny because scripture definitely says that we are called to love God and love others. We've got this great commandment principle that we can live in light of. I think if we are doing that and we're saying, okay, if I'm to find God's will by finding where he is at work and joining him there, then the next question has to be, well, where is God at work? And if we look through scripture, he's always at work with our vulnerable neighbors. And so I think one of the best ways to find God's will is to start with those who are vulnerable around you and just start serving them and just pull that thread, meet the needs of the person in front of you. As you're seeking God in other ways, seek God through seeking your neighbor and see what happens. As you pull that thread, you're going to see where you're led. God is going to lead you in a certain direction.
You said in the book that we should stop picking our neighbors, kind of building on what you just said about reaching out to your neighbors. What do you mean by that? We should not pick our neighbors?
I think it's very clear if we just walk into our churches on a Sunday morning that our churches often reflect us. They're going to reflect our socio-economic background, our cultural background, oftentimes, because regardless of what cultural background we come from, we like to be comfortable. And the thing about loving those most vulnerable is that it's very easy to love the people that are sanitary, that are clean, that don't have any stigmas they're dealing with, that aren't dealing with trauma. But, God's not calling us to love the neighbors of our choosing. He's calling us to love the neighbors of his choosing. And I think the parable of the Good Samaritan is a great picture of that. You have two people who couldn't be more separated by their own political views as well as their religious views. Yet a Samaritan, someone who's considered a half-breed, someone who's considered unclean, goes to help a Jewish man dying in a road who most likely hates this man and doesn't want to receive his help, but he helps him nonetheless. And I think that's what it can look like when we love the neighbors of God's choosing.
And of course, this doesn't have to be just finding the homeless person on the wrong side of town, so to speak. I mean, this can apply at our workplace, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How, can you give me an example of how our listeners could apply this concept at where they work?
So, I mean, here's the thing. This goes back to, I would say, like an average experience in a high school cafeteria. You walk into a high school cafeteria, you're trying to meet friends, you're trying to be around the people who make you feel comfortable. And then there are other people that you just avoid. And you avoid them for a million reasons, but you avoid them nonetheless. And I feel like though we grow up, though we get degrees, though we cement ourselves in a workplace culture that makes us feel great about ourselves, we forget that though we've changed, we haven't changed that much. And we do the same thing. We run the high school cafeteria politic in the workplace. And there will be people that we avoid because, wow, that person's too much drama, or I don't really trust that person, or we don't know that person. And I think for us to love the neighbor of God's choosing in the workplace, we have to stop telling the narrative of someone in our heads and actually listen to their story. Because if we want to get to know someone, we actually have to sit down and hear their story on their terms. And it may frustrate us. It may hurt us initially, but it will broaden us and it will deepen our dependence on the gospel.
This would include like the people that that are maybe the most difficult, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, because those are the people in the workplace we avoid. I mean,
Right.
I worked in a cubicle wasteland, prior to doing what I'm doing now, and I actually really liked it because, there was this cubicles as far as the eye could see, and I had mine dressed up. I loved it. But you know what? There were people in my department that I just did not talk to. I tried to talk to everybody, but there were still people that I found it hard to communicate with because they might be gruff. They might be difficult to spend time with. But you know
Right.
what? I wasn't thinking, well, what's this person going through? And how can I get to the thing behind the thing? That's why I wasn't there. I wasn't wrestling with that at that time. I think now I would do it differently.
Well, you talk a lot in the book about how the vulnerability is not just a problem, both when it comes to human trafficking as well as other, areas in life, but it's also a part of the solution. And you talk about how, if I read this right, that we need to be more vulnerable about ourselves, and by doing that, it's not a bad thing. And I think this is an important topic for men, especially because our society doesn't encourage that of men generally. Can you talk, is what I've said correct? And can you talk more about that? You also talked about how you can actually, it can be like a gift that you give to others is when you're vulnerable. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, vulnerability is not easy, but I think it's worth it because at the end of the day, when we talk to people and we are actually being authentic and we are being transparent, but in a way that is actually costly to us, like transparent in a way where we're actually risking something, that inspires the reciprocity of others. People want to do the same because they want to know that it's okay to actually talk about what you're experiencing. And I feel like a lot of men, we have been taught this really, anemic view of masculinity. This idea that emotional constipation is the norm and it should be the thing to which we aspire. And no, it's not. Like at the end of the day, we can see true manhood in the person of Christ. And yes, Christ stood his ground at points. Christ flipped the table. He did these things. He hung with his friends. He did incredible things. But at the end of the day, we also have to recognize he also expressed intense emotions. He was willing to tell people that he loved them. He was willing to put himself out there so that he could be hurt. And I think here's a problem. If we focus on self-protection, because that's what it is, if we focus on self-protection, we'll never be free to protect others. That's the bottom line.
Well, that's true. Maybe nowhere even more strongly than in our relationship with our wife. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, we can't protect them unless we're willing to be vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think married couples, there's no way to actually improve your love life without being vulnerable, without risking something. And when you're just trying to defend your little corner of your reality as a couple, you're not going to move forward. You're just going to stay in this weird stasis, and you're not going to grow together. But yeah, you have to risk being hurt and hurting the other person at times to actually grow.
Now, you made a reference to, how this was, well, first of all, that Jesus demonstrated vulnerability just by his very act of becoming human, which is certainly true. But you also talked about how you could argue that his attacks on the Pharisees, which were strong and numerous, had a lot to do around this vulnerability issue. In other words, his beef with I've always thought of it, his beef with the Pharisees was that they had a religious spirit and they were missing what was most important, which is to love others. And I think that's true. You think it's also fair to say that they were not being vulnerable, and they were being, and as a result, they weren't looking out for those that were vulnerable? Is that a fair assessment, you think?
Yeah, I think when you see what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees, and when he's calling them out and he's saying, "You brood of vipers," he's got strong language. But I was actually reading this morning in my devotional time. He looks at them and says, "You hypocrites, you tithe dill and cumin, and all these things, but you don't know anything about justice and mercy." In this idea, this word, hypocrite, I actually talk about this in the book. If you trace this back, it's a word picture of Greek actors who would wear masks and portray something else that they really weren't. And he's basically saying, you and your religiosity, you are using your religiosity as a mask, and you're hiding behind it. It's almost as if he's saying, take it off. Because if they take off the mask, not only will they cease to be hypocrites, but they'll actually be vulnerable. Because now they are portrayed as they are. Now they are seen for who they are. And I think that's what we have with a lot of our own self-righteous tendencies that can crop up as Christians. I mean, we end up hiding behind our own masks, and we're not vulnerable.
Well, we talk a lot in Christianity about having a deeper relationship with God. This is a real barrier to that as well, isn't it, if we're not vulnerable?
Yeah, because here's the thing. Like, if you're not vulnerable with God, you're not going to be vulnerable with others, and most likely vice versa. It's funny. I was talking with someone recently about a phenomenon that I don't know if your church had this, but I know growing up in church, when we would pray together, they would take prayer requests, and someone would say, my aunt is sick, she may die. And then another person's like, I have a job interview. And then another person says, you know what, I have 2 unspokens. And I started to notice this phenomenon of the unspoken. People kept saying it. I was serving at different churches. Well, I have an unspoken. I have an unspoken. I have an unspoken. I have an unspoken. The thing about unspokens is you're not saying anything. Like, this prayer should be an opportunity for you to say, hey, I know I need prayer, and I'm going to share it with you. Because chances are that person's not really being real with the thing they're wrestling with. And it takes trust, and maybe those people aren't the person you want to trust your prayer to, but like at the end of the day, we need to banish this idea of unspokens and actually speak this out, because not only do we need to pray this to God, but we need other people tracking with us in our vulnerability. We can't do this alone.
Well, I think another area that this touches on for me is this whole issue with men of having friends and real friends, you know, and men that you get together regularly with. Which is something I've been purposeful recently about, and actually being vulnerable in that way and going beyond just talking about politics and sports. So, I mean, it's interesting how important this is in so many areas of our life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. In New York City, where I live, it's a very transient community. And so I went through 3 friend groups in 6 years. You know, every 2 years, some of my closest friends would leave, because that's what happens. Generally, people are here for about 2 years and make a name for themselves and move away. And that wasn't the case for all of my friends, but a lot of them just left. And it was really hard for me. And I got to a point where I just didn't make friends anymore. I'm traveling a good bit. I have friends around the country. I'll just hang out with them. But then one day I realized I wasn't traveling. I was by myself. There was nothing to do. And it hit me. I'm like, I didn't have any friends here in the city. And so I kind of set myself on this course of meeting people, hanging out with people, and really investing in the male friendships that I had. And really investing in all the friendships that I had, but also like trying to find men to hang out with on a consistent basis who could speak into my life. And so that's taken the shape of, some of them are mentors, some of them are just close friends. But yeah, it's like guys that I like to hang out with regularly that, you know, we can get real about stuff.
I was just thinking about the phrase that we won't lay on our deathbed and think, I wish I had spent more time working. For some reason, I had this thought pop in my head that in a similar way, we probably won't lay on our deathbed and think, boy, I wish I would have been more guarded with myself. I wish I wouldn't have opened up as much as I did. You know, more likely it's the opposite. We'll wish we had been a little more vulnerable.
You know, it's funny. It's like we protect ourselves so we don't lose the thing we crave. But unless we're vulnerable, we're going to lose the thing we crave. You know, it's like, whether that's acceptance, whether that's community, whether that's solid friendships, it's going to go away if we're not willing to lay our defenses down, at least every now and then, you know. And I think so many of us have been hurt, and so many of us who are men have been taught, you need to be a certain way. You need to exert dominance. You need to show that you're a leader. You don't need to show weakness, because if you show weakness, then no one will follow you. No one will respect you. You'll never find a woman who will love you, because nice guys finish last. Like, we're taught this, you know, and we're shaped by this, and we've got to rewrite the narrative.
Well, I'll just be vulnerable and say one of my issues is being judgmental. I mean, judgmental of my wife and others I work with, and in other words, looking for the splinter in someone's eye and not noticing the log in my own eye. And it's been something I've been aware of for a long time, and you know, I'm better than I used to be, but I'm just thinking that this is a way to deal with that issue, which is to be more humble about my own flaws, I guess is one way of saying it, as a way of focusing less on the flaws of others. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think as long as you have community, and as long as you have people walking through that process with you, you can do this in a healthy way. I think sometimes when we start thinking about our vulnerabilities, and then we just go to this really dark place. But we've got to see that our vulnerabilities are a good thing. It's like I write in the book about strength finders and how so many of us try to find our strengths and just go forward. We want to know our strengths and then just use them. That was one of the greatest things I learned, I thought, when I was a first year youth pastor in 2001. I was like, man, I'm just going to focus on my strengths, forget my weaknesses. But, you know, as I grew up, I realized your strengths can become toxic if that's all you're using. And so what would it look like to allow my weaknesses to kind of be like a governor on my strengths, to kind of regulate me, to remind me that I am not the Savior, but someone else is, and his name is Jesus. We need people to walk with us and to remind us that it's really our strength is found in our weakness.
Yeah, I've always wrestled a little bit about with that verse, and this helps me understand that better about how he uses our weakness. I wanted to ask you about this idea of the difference between the theology of glory and the theology of the cross.
Oh, yeah.
What is the difference?
Yeah, so it's interesting because oftentimes our approach to life, to the church, to everything is a theology of glory. It's this idea that God wants us almost healthy, wealthy, and wise, and that we can do it in our strength. And so when we get sick or if something goes wrong, you can spot, if you have a theology of glory, really quickly when things fall apart and you say, God, why? Why did that happen? I was doing this, I was doing that, I was checking all the boxes, and now you have left me. Where are you? Are you even here? While the theology of the cross will say, it's in your suffering, it's in your brokenness that you are closest to Jesus. Even our sharing the gospel is coming from a broken place of broken people following a broken Messiah. And as we serve people, we're serving through our vulnerability. And so the theology of the cross is really the theology of glory turned on its head. You know, with the anti-trafficking space, it's very easy to spot a theology of glory when someone is saying, you know, we're going to end trafficking now. And we can do it if we just get together. Well, here's the thing, like, it is not wrong. And I am not saying it's wrong to say we need to end human trafficking now, because we do. But sometimes when we have this view and we dive into the work and we're not seeing the results that we want, it's easy to burn out and quit. But when we realize this is going to be a tough road and it's going to hurt and it's going to require things from us that may be hard to give, and we're going to suffer as we care for people who are suffering. If we have that mindset, chances are we're going to endure longer because we won't be taken by surprise.
All right. Well, I don't want to miss out on talking a little bit about human trafficking. I appreciate you answering all my questions about this issue of vulnerability. I've gotten a lot out of that. But let's spend the last minutes we have talking about some of the myths that you talk about in your book about human trafficking. I think it's a very important issue, and I think that these myths you touch on are helpful in educating myself and others. So the first one you talk about is that usually, well, why don't you just, I have it in front of me, but if you just want to mention some of the key myths, maybe that's the right way to do it.
Well, I mean, some off the top of my head would be, oftentimes when people think about human trafficking, they think that human trafficking will only happen in a community that is near a big city or a porous border or near a highway system. Here's the thing. Human trafficking is the exploitation of vulnerability for commercial gain. Human trafficking can happen anywhere because there are vulnerable people everywhere. That's just the short and skinny of it. That's the truth. Like, if there's someone with power and there's someone without power, there's the opportunity for that person with power to exploit the one without. And so, yes, it can happen anywhere where there are power differentials, where there are people who are stigmatized, people who are marginalized, and there are people who aren't. I mean, that can happen. Another myth that I think is very interesting is oftentimes people conflate human trafficking solely with sex trafficking. And that's not true. Human trafficking consists of sex trafficking, for sure, where people are trafficked into brothels, they're trafficked into pornography, they're trafficked into street prostitution, they're trafficked to do webcams and stripping and things of the like. But they're also trafficked into labor as well as domestic servitude. They're trafficked to work on farms, to work construction crews, to hold signs on the side of the road for stores, to panhandle. They're trafficked into the hospitality industry, into the restaurant industry. They're serving as nannies. People can also be trafficked into working in mines or child soldiering. You know, if there's a demand for it, people will be trafficked for it. That's just how this works.
Well, some of the methods that you talked about that are used too were I wasn't aware of, and maybe to the extent that you described, but like one of them is debt bondage. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so oftentimes a trafficker will, to make someone more vulnerable, will make that person owe them something. And they will continue to increase the debt so that they say, you know what, you just need to continue to work this off and then you'll pay this debt. But they're never able to work this debt off. And so they're stuck. And a lot of people in this situation just think they're in a job. They don't know that they've been trafficked, because another myth is that all human trafficking is not kidnapping. That can and does happen, but it's relatively rare. Oftentimes people think they're in a bad job or they have a bad relationship, but they've been groomed for exploitation.
Well, I think along those same lines, one of your myths was that people don't always self-identify. I think that's what you're saying. And there's a whole host of reasons why they don't think of themselves as being trafficked, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they're in a place where, yeah, they just think they're in a bad job or a bad relationship. They're not they think it's almost normal sometimes. I'm not saying that they're not seeing a lot of the negative. Oh, they are. But traffickers consistently target those whose backs are against the wall.
So I don't want to leave our discussion without asking you to throw out some suggestions for how any of our listeners can make a difference in this area. We've talked in kind of general terms about kind of how we go about our daily life. But for someone who wants to specifically do something about trafficking, what would be your suggestion?
Well, one thing they could do is, honestly, buy the book. And if they didn't buy my book, buy a book on human trafficking, and learn about the issue. Because most people do not know. They'll say, well, I'm aware of human trafficking. Awareness means you're able to identify and respond. I bet you dollars to donuts, as they say, that if I asked the average person who knew about human trafficking how to recognize it on the street, they'd have no idea. And so read well, read often, read about the issue. One thing that's in Vulnerable Rethinking Human Trafficking is at the very back, there are 100 ways you can fight human trafficking today. It's an appendix. And I list several books that are great to read. I list several websites that you can go to. I list the human trafficking hotline number, which is 1-888-3737-888. And I just really walk them through things that you can do right now to fight human trafficking.
So tell us again the title of your book and best way they could get it.
Yeah, so my book is called Vulnerable, Rethinking Human Trafficking. And you can find this on Amazon, Walmart.com, Barnes & Noble, BAM. I mean, you can find it anywhere. You can book.com. That's thevulnerable.book.com, basically one word. You can order it through that website, and it has all of those vendors as well. And it'll also tell you a little bit about the book, and there's a video there and all that. And so,
well, if someone wanted to reach out to you and learn more about not just the book but about your ministry, how would they go about doing that?
they would go to Let My People Go's website, which is LMPG, like Let My People Go, lmpgnetwork.org. And so it's lmpgnetwork.org.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap this up?
Yes, I have one thought. I want whoever's listening to know that the things that you think disqualify you from serving vulnerable people are the things that actually qualify you. Your vulnerabilities that make you feel like you shouldn't have a voice are the things that should actually embolden you, because they're the things that put you on the same level as another vulnerable person. Give yourself the opportunity to think your brokenness can ultimately point someone to wholeness.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your time and for this great discussion, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Men at Work, I hope you enjoyed this interview as much as I did. We just heard about Raleigh Sadler's journey being spirit-led and living out his Christian faith at his work. Each of our journeys are unique, but hopefully you've heard something in this episode to inspire you and give direction for your own personal daily work life. You can find links and other information from this show at davehilgendorf.com. Until next time, have a great day and God bless.